By the middle of 1943, the United States military had somewhere between 15,000 and 45,000 servicemen stationed on New Zealand soil. They were in the parks. They were in the public domains. Camp Hale sat directly in front of the Auckland Museum. American camps had spread across Waikaraka Park in Wahunga, across Papakura, across Wellington. The Americans had come to New Zealand to recover, to refit, to prepare for the next push up the Solomon Islands chain. They came with equipment that New Zealanders had never seen in those quantities: vehicles, rations, aircraft, firepower, and they brought with them the unspoken weight of a nation that had decided this was its war to run. New Zealand had a population of approximately 1.5 million people. That fact tells you almost everything you need to know about what happened next. In 1942, the New Zealand government had made an offer. A full division, the 3rd New Zealand Division, was available, trained, and ready to fight. The offer went to Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, the American commander of the South Pacific area. Gormley's answer was essentially, no thank you. His position was clear and documented. New Zealand forces would serve in a garrison role. They would free up American soldiers for frontline fighting. That was their contribution. That was their lane. He was, according to the research record, insistent on this point and resistant to New Zealand political pressure to expand that role. When Gormley was replaced by Admiral William Halsey in late 1942, some things changed, but not the essential dynamic. Halsey saw a potential role for the Kiwis in first-line operations. He also made his own assessment of what New Zealand had brought to the table, and that assessment was recorded. He was, in his own words, greatly disappointed that New Zealand could not furnish a division with 3 full brigades. There were only 2. New Zealand's manpower was already committed across 3 theaters simultaneously: North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific, for a country of 1.5 million people. That context did not appear to factor heavily into Halsey's disappointment. What he had wanted, New Zealand could not provide at that scale. What it could provide, the American command structure slotted into the available space and labeled accordingly. The label they reached for when the 3rd New Zealand Division was given its operational role in the Solomons Campaign of 1943 was this: mopping up. That word is worth sitting with for a moment. Mopping up is what you do after the real work is done. It's the clearance operation, the follow-on force. It's the assignment you give to troops you trust to hold ground that better men already took. In the military hierarchy of 1943, it sat well below the assault, well below the main effort, and well below the kind of action that earns a unit its reputation. When the Americans planned the next push up the Solomons chain, New, Georgia, Vella Lavella, the Treasury Islands. The main assault assignments went to American divisions. The 3rd New Zealand Division would handle what remained afterward. This was not a secret or a slight delivered in private. It was structural. It was the shape of the coalition as American command had designed it. The New Zealanders were placed under the U.S.Y. Marine Amphibious Corps. In every operation they undertook, the United States Navy provided the naval forces. The air coverage was overwhelmingly American. The New Zealanders provided the ground component for the smaller island actions, the ones the Americans had already touched and not quite finished, and they did so as a follow-on force. Mopping up. After the war, the men of the 3rd New Zealand Division came home to a name, not a proud one. The nickname that circulated, the one that stuck to their service in the years that followed, was Coconut Bombers. It was not affectionate. It carried the implication that these men had spent the war in the Pacific without really fighting, that they had swatted at coconut trees rather than at the Japanese. The Auckland War Memorial Museum's record of their service notes plainly that they were undeservedly seen as second-class veterans. Undeservedly. That word is doing a lot of work in a sentence that most people have never read. The 3rd Division was not celebrated after the war. There were no major public commemorations proportionate to the record. The men returned to a New Zealand that needed their labor more urgently than their stories, a country in a manpower crisis, pulling soldiers off the islands and directing them back to farms and factories because the economy was breaking under the weight of 3 years of war. Some went to Italy, most went home. The division was formally disbanded on October 20th, 1944. And the name followed them: coconut bombers, second-class veterans, men who had handled the leftovers. Now, hold that image. Hold the image of an Allied command structure that had refused New Zealand's offer of a full division, that had expressed disappointment at what a nation of 1.5 million could sustain across 3 simultaneous theaters of war, that had assigned the 3rd Division to the follow-on role and called it mopping up, and whose veterans would spend decades afterwards being casually dismissed as men who hadn't really been in it. Hold that, and then ask a different question. While the American command was processing its disappointment in New Zealand's contribution, what were American forces actually doing in the Solomons? What did the main effort look like? What happened when the United States military, with its resources, its firepower, its National Guard divisions, its naval and air superiority, went after the same kind of island jungle that the 3rd New Zealand Division was handed as a cleanup task? That is a question with a documented answer. And the answer is the reason this story exists. In the summer of 1943, the American main effort in the Central Solomons was the assault on New Georgia Island. The objective was Munda Airfield, a critical piece of ground that, once taken, would push Allied air coverage another step toward Rabaul and the eventual isolation of the Japanese position in the Pacific. The operation was designated Toenails. The lead formation was the 43rd Infantry Division, a National Guard outfit drawn from the states of Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, and Vermont. The 43rd Division was the American main effort, not a mopping-up force, not a follow-on formation. The tip of the spear, supported by naval gunfire, airstrikes, Marine raiders, and the full weight of the American logistical machine. They landed on New Georgia on the 2nd of July, 1943. What happened to them over the following weeks is what you need to understand before a single New Zealander sets foot on Vella Lavella. Because when the 3rd New Zealand Division arrived to handle their portion of the Solomons campaign, outnumbered by the defenders, in dense jungle, in torrential rain, with less equipment and fewer men than the American formation that had preceded them, the comparison between what each force produced from that environment is the most honest measure of what the word training actually means when a jungle is the examiner. The Americans had more of everything. What did they do with it? And what exactly were these so-called coconut bombers walking into when they took over on Vella Lavella, an island that American forces had held for a month and still hadn't cleared? That is where this story goes next. New Georgia Island, July 2nd, 1943. The 43rd Infantry Division came ashore on the western coast of New Georgia with a mission that American planners considered achievable in days. Take Munda Airfield, secure it, move on. The Japanese had approximately 10,500 troops on the island, dug in, waiting. The Americans had the 43rd Division, Marine raiders, naval gunfire, air support, and the full backing of Admiral Halsey's South Pacific Command. On paper, it was not a close contest. The jungle did not care about the paper. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came before a single major engagement had been fought. The 169th Infantry Regiment, one of the 43rd's 3 infantry regiments, was supposed to form up and begin its advance toward Munda on the night of July 9th. It did not form up. What happened instead, in the darkness of the New Georgia jungle, was that soldiers of the 169th spent the night shooting at each other, firing at sounds, at movement that wasn't there, at shadows in vegetation so dense that a man could vanish 3 feet from his position and not be found. The regiment had been introduced to combat and had essentially seized up, paralyzed by an environment it did not understand, by a darkness that offered no reference points, and by an enemy that knew exactly how to exploit both. This was not a small unit losing its nerve. This was a regiment. When the main attack finally commenced on the 11th of July, both regiments quickly suffered depletion, not primarily from enemy fire, but from disease, from exhaustion, and from what the medical reports would later categorize as combat fatigue. Men were leaving the line not in body bags, but on stretchers, shaking, unable to function, their nervous systems registering the jungle as a threat their training had given them no tools to process. General Oscar Griswold, the 14th Corps commander, flew to New Georgia on the 11th of July to assess the situation himself. What he found, he reported without diplomatic cushioning. "Things are going badly," Griswold wrote. The 43rd Division, in his assessment, seemed ready to fold up. That assessment from a senior American general about his own forces, in the first major land operation they had been handed since Guadalcanal, is in the official record. It is not a historian's interpretation. It is not a post-war reconstruction. Griswold said it at the time about men who were still in the field, and the candor of it reflects how serious the situation had become. His reward for this assessment was appointment as overall commander of the operation, charged with stabilizing what had come apart. What he found in the 43rd Division was a unit experiencing something the Army had encountered before, but had done almost nothing to prepare for. The psychiatrists who arrived to assess the casualties used the term war neurosis. Soldiers in the field were calling it something simpler, going wacky. The numbers that eventually came out of New Georgia are, by any measure, staggering. Between 30 June and 30 September 1943, more than 2,500 American troops on New Georgia were diagnosed with neuropsychiatric casualties. The 43rd Division's 3 infantry regiments generated over 1,500 of those cases on their own, accounting for 62% of the total. The 169th Regiment, the one that had spent its first night shooting at itself in the dark, was the worst affected of any unit in the operation. Historians examining this record later concluded that the 43rd Division experienced the highest neuropsychiatric casualty rate of any American division in a single operation in the entire Second World War. Not the Pacific, the entire war. The 14th Corps surgeon, who compiled his findings in October 1943, had been on New Georgia himself. He had listened to the men. He had watched them. What he documented was not cowardice. It was the systematic breakdown of soldiers who had been placed in an environment they had not been trained for, under leadership that could not compensate for that gap at the critical platoon and company level, against an enemy that understood the jungle and used it as a weapon. The 43rd Division, the study concluded, had not consisted of inferior men. It had consisted of men whose methods of recruitment, whose training regimen, and whose garrison duties en route to combat had left them wholly unprepared for what New Georgia actually was. One detail from those records is worth stopping on. At some point during the New Georgia fighting, 2 American soldiers found themselves in a foxhole facing another night in the jungle. They knew what the previous nights had produced. They knew that in the confusion of darkness, soldiers had shot and stabbed each other, mistaking comrades for the enemy in terrain where visibility collapsed to nothing after sundown. They made a decision. The 2 men joined their left arms together at the elbow in a Roman-style handshake. In their right hands, they each held a bayonet. The logic: if something attacked in the darkness, the man you were joined to had to be your friend. You would know who to kill. It never occurred to them, the record notes, that one of them might sleep while the other kept watch. This is a documented incident. It is not an anecdote meant to diminish these men. It is a precise measurement of what the jungle had done to the capacity for rational decision-making in soldiers who had been in it too long without the preparation that might have made it manageable. They were not broken men. They were men applying improvised logic to a situation that their training had not anticipated. The improvisation tells you everything about the gap. By the time Munda Airfield finally fell on August 5, 1943, the operation had consumed 4 American divisions, the 43rd, the 37th, the 25th. Elements of the 1st Marine Raiders, what had been projected as a single-division operation had required 4 times the planned force, had taken 36 days instead of the anticipated few, and had produced casualty figures, both physical and psychiatric, that would be studied in military medical literature for decades. The official American record framed the eventual outcome as a demonstration of dogged endurance, adaptive planning, and joint service cooperation. That framing is not inaccurate. The Americans did ultimately take Munda. What it cost them and why it cost them that much is the part of the record that got less attention. On August 15, 1943, 10 days after Munda fell, American forces landed on Vella La Vella. The island sat northwest of New Georgia. Taking it would bypass the heavily fortified Japanese garrison at Kolombangara, isolating those troops without a direct assault. The strategic logic was sound. The Americans landed 4,600 men, established a secure beachhead in the south, and began pushing the Japanese garrison northward. The Japanese resisted. Throughout August and into September, American forces pressed north. The Japanese compressed into the upper portion of the island, but did not break. The airfield in the south was under construction. The radar station and motor torpedo boat base that justified the operation could not be completed, while an active enemy force remained capable of interference in the north. By mid-September, the Americans held the south of Vella La Vella. The Japanese, an estimated 600 to 1,000 men, held the north. The situation had stalled. Someone was needed to break it. On the 18th of September 1943, approximately 3,700 men of the New Zealand 14th Brigade Group landed at the American beachhead on Vella La Vella. They landed with less naval support than the American formations that had preceded them. They had no armored component to speak of. They were outnumbered by the Japanese defenders they had been sent to find and destroy. They had, however, been trained differently. What that difference looked like in practice, how it was built, what it produced, and what the numbers eventually recorded, is a story that the American command structure had not anticipated, and the historical record has not properly told. Until now, before a single New Zealander set foot on Vella La Vella, before the 14th Brigade Group loaded onto its landing craft and moved north from Guadalcanal, before any of the fighting that this story is building toward, there was a training program. And that training program is the actual subject of this chapter. Because the outcome on Vella La Vella was not an accident, it was not luck, and it was not the product of a less dangerous assignment. It was the result of decisions made 18 months earlier by a general who understood something about jungle warfare that the American command structure, at that point in the war, had not yet fully absorbed. The general's name was Harold Barrowclough. Major General Harold Eric Barrowclough had taken command of the 3rd New Zealand Division in August 1942. He was a lawyer by profession. He would eventually become Chief Justice of New Zealand, and he brought to military command the same methodical precision that law requires. He had fought in the First World War. He had commanded an infantry brigade in Greece. He had watched over the course of 1942 as the Pacific War revealed its character. Dense jungle, broken terrain, no roads, an enemy that was patient, disciplined, and entirely comfortable in the environment that was destroying Western units from the inside. Barrowclough drew a conclusion from what he observed, and that conclusion shaped everything his division became. Overwhelming firepower was not the answer in this theater. Not because firepower was useless, it wasn't, but because the jungle negated the conditions under which mass firepower produced decisive results. You could not call in artillery on a target you could not see. You could not direct airstrikes onto positions you had not located. You could not use numerical superiority when the terrain channeled your force into columns that stripped away the advantage of numbers. The jungle reduced every operation to its smallest. Components: the squad, the platoon, the company. If those elements could not function independently, with judgment, with discipline, and with the physical and psychological endurance that jungle warfare demands, then the division above them could not function either. What Barrowclough built in response to that conclusion was a division oriented around combined arms battalion combat teams, smaller than a standard divisional formation, self-sufficient, capable of operating across multiple axes without constant reference to higher command. Units that could make decisions when communication failed, when the map stopped matching the ground, when the situation became the kind of fluid, disorienting, close-range problem that the jungle specializes in producing. That was the concept. The training program was how it became real. The men who would eventually land on Vella La Vella had been in preparation since 1941. The 35th Battalion and the 37th Battalion, the two formations that would execute the pincer movement on Vella La Vella, had both deployed to Fiji in early 1942 for garrison duty. And while garrison duty sounds unglamorous, in the New Zealand case, it was also training time in a tropical environment. When they returned to New Zealand in mid-1942, the training continued. The 29th Battalion's record documents an intensive exercise in the Kaimai Ranges, the hill country of the North Island's Waikato region, focused specifically on bush and mountain warfare. This was not theoretical. It was physical, prolonged, and designed to build the kind of environmental confidence that the jungle requires before it will allow a soldier to think clearly inside it. Then New Caledonia. The division moved there in December 1942 for further jungle training, replacing American units that had moved forward to Guadalcanal. The island gave them months of acclimatization, of technical preparation, of working through the specific physical problems of operating in tropical terrain, heat, disease, navigation, the particular demands of patrolling in triple canopy jungle, where visibility collapses to meters and sound, becomes the primary intelligence source. Then Guadalcanal itself in August 1943. The 35th and 37th Battalions arrived on the island a month before they were committed to Vella La Vella. They established camps, conducted patrols, monitored the coastlines. They did not sit and wait. They moved in the environment and let the environment become familiar. By the time Brigadier Leslie Potter's 14th Brigade Group boarded its landing craft on the 18th of September, 1943, the men of the 35th and 37th Battalions had been preparing in progressive stages for approximately 2 years. They had trained in New Zealand's bush, in Fiji's tropics, in New Caledonia's jungle, and on Guadalcanal's broken, contested terrain. Not one of those stages was wasted. Each built on the previous one, each narrowed the gap between what the jungle demanded and what the soldier could provide. The 43rd Division had trained in New England. Then it had gone to New Georgia. On September 18th, Potter's force landed at the American beachhead on Vella La Vella's southern coast. The Japanese garrison, the surviving elements of what had resisted American pressure through August and into September, held the northern portion of the island. Their numbers were estimated at somewhere between 600 and 1,000 men. Potter's force totaled approximately 3,700. On paper, a numerical advantage. In practice, the Japanese were entrenched, they knew the terrain, and they had spent the previous month demonstrating that a determined defense in jungle could hold off a larger force indefinitely. Potter did not attempt to assault them directly. What he did instead was split his force. The 35th Battalion would advance up the eastern coast of the island. The 37th Battalion would advance up the western coast. 2 axes, simultaneous. The tactic was not a frontal push, it was a progressive compression. Small parties from each battalion were landed by craft at successive bays along the coastline, leapfrogging Japanese positions, cutting off retreat routes, forcing the enemy to respond to threats from multiple directions at once. While a landing party fixed Japanese attention at one point, the main force moved to the next bay and landed ahead of them. The Japanese, oriented to defend against a linear advance, found themselves being encircled by a force that was using the coastline as a road and the sea as a highway. It was methodical. It was adaptive. It required junior commanders to make sound decisions in real time without waiting for orders from above, because the nature of the tactic meant that communication was intermittent and the situation was always changing. This is what combined arms battalion combat teams actually looked like in practice. Not a doctrine written on paper, but a set of capabilities that had been built into the men over 2 years of progressive preparation and were now being expressed against a prepared enemy in difficult terrain. By early October, the two New Zealand forces had compressed the Japanese garrison into a small pocket in the island's northwest corner. The enemy was bottled. Their escape routes were closed. On the night of 6 to 7 October, the Japanese Navy intervened and evacuated the remaining 589 men by destroyer. A separate story, a Japanese tactical success in its own right, but one that did not alter what the New Zealanders had achieved on the ground. The operation on Vella La Vella had lasted 18 days. New Zealand casualties, 32 killed, 32 wounded. Japanese killed by New Zealand ground forces, between 200 and 300. Now place those numbers beside the American experience on New Georgia, the comparable island operation that had immediately preceded Vella La Vella in the same campaign, against the same enemy, in the same theater. New Georgia, 4 American divisions committed, 36 days of fighting, 1,195 Americans killed, 3,873 wounded, 2,500 neuropsychiatric casualties, the highest rate recorded for any American division in a single operation in the entire Second World War. The script does not ask you to draw a conclusion from those numbers. The numbers draw their own conclusion. 2 island operations, same jungle, same Japanese enemy, same strategic context. One involved 4 divisions and produced catastrophic psychiatric breakdown alongside more than 1,000 dead. The other involved 1 understrength brigade group, took 18 days, and produced 32 graves. The difference was not the islands. The difference was not the Japanese. The difference was what the men had been taught to do before they ever got there, and what they hadn't been taught. The difference was the training. That is the clean version of this story. The operational record, the unit histories, the casualty figures laid side by side. But there is a version of this story that the numbers alone don't carry. When the men of the 14th Brigade Group arrived at the American beachhead on the southern coast of Vella La Vella on the 18th of September 1943, they were not landing on an empty beach. American soldiers were there. The handover was real. One force replacing another, looking at each other across the transition, each forming impressions of what they were seeing. What the New Zealanders found when they arrived. What they recorded about it. What the men who had come through New Georgia and a month on Vella La Vella looked like to soldiers who had spent 2 years being built for exactly this kind of fight. That is where this story goes next. When the men of the 3rd New Zealand Division arrived at Guadalcanal in August 1943, they were not arriving at a base. They were arriving at a wound. The island had been fought over for a year. The Americans had landed in August 1942 and had not secured it until February 1943. 6 months of naval battles in the surrounding waters, of airstrikes, of ground fighting through jungle and across ridgelines, had left Guadalcanal with the specific character that only sustained high-intensity combat produces, a landscape that has been physically rearranged by violence and has not yet recovered. The New Zealanders came ashore into that. Peter Renshaw, who served with the 36th Battalion, recorded his impression in terms that have stayed in the archive since the war ended. Wherever you went, there'd be bones, he said. And then, with the simplicity that direct experience produces, we realized how savage the fighting was. Guadalcanal was really a battle that one side or the other had to win to stay in the war. That last sentence is not an exaggeration. It is a statement of operational fact from a man who had just walked across the evidence of it. The bones were not metaphorical. They were there, in the ground, protruding from it, scattered across terrain that the pace of the fighting had not allowed to be properly cleared. RNZAF, Corporal Bill Mitchell arrived on the island the same month. What he recorded, and what has been preserved in the New Zealand History National Archive, is one of the most direct primary accounts of what American-style warfare looked like from the outside, to men who had been trained to fight differently. His words deserve to be heard without interruption. It was dense jungle, and all that was left were a few shattered stumps. The rest of it was like a plowed field from all the shell bursts. There was equipment everywhere, spent cartridges, rifles, debris everywhere. It was frightening. The smell of death. The Americans had bulldozed great big holes and pushed all the corpses in and put in quicklime in the front line, but up in the hills you couldn't do that, and there were arms and legs and limbs sticking out everywhere. The smell. Dead bodies. When we came back from that front line, we couldn't eat our lunch. The smell of dead bodies in the tropics is something else. It's something you can't get rid of. It was upsetting. Read that again slowly, not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of what it describes at a practical level. The Americans had bulldozed mass graves in the accessible areas and used quicklime to manage decomposition. In the hills where the machinery could not go, they had not managed it at all. Arms and legs were still visible above the soil line. In the tropical heat, the decomposition rate is rapid, and the odor is, as Mitchell says, something else. The New Zealand soldiers who arrived in August 1943 could not eat their food after returning from the front positions because of what the smell did to them. This is what the aftermath of overwhelming firepower looks like when it has been applied in terrain that cannot be systematically cleared afterward. It is not a moral judgment on the Americans who fought there. It is a description of what the method costs, measured in a currency that the body count figures do not capture. The New Zealanders who arrived at Guadalcanal in August 1943 had spent 2 years being built into something specific. They had trained in bush and mountain country in New Zealand. They had acclimatized in Fiji and New Caledonia. Their officers had been taught to think in terms of small unit independence, of adaptive movement, of using terrain rather than erasing it. They arrived on Guadalcanal as a trained force, looking at the residue of a very different approach to the same problem. What they saw did not produce admiration. The word that comes closer to what the primary sources convey is disquiet. A quiet, practical reckoning with the gap between what had been done here and what they understood to be possible. This was not arrogance. The men of the 43rd Division and the Marines who had fought on Guadalcanal had done something genuinely difficult and genuinely costly, and they had ultimately prevailed. That is not a small thing. The New Zealanders who arrived in their wake understood that. But understanding that something was hard and understanding that it might have been done differently are not mutually exclusive recognitions. And the men who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this theater of war, who had been told they were a garrison force and a mopping-up unit, were now looking at the landscape that the main effort had produced. The landscape did not suggest that the main effort had known what it was doing. The feelings that New Zealand veterans expressed about their American counterparts in the Solomons were not simple, and it would misrepresent the record to flatten them into a single attitude. There was genuine warmth in many individual interactions. There was professional respect in some quarters. The Americans who came to New Zealand to recover and retrain were in many cases young and frightened and far from home, and New Zealand families took them in with the generosity that wartime produces between people who understand they are on the same side of the same terrible thing. but at the operational level, at the level of how you move in jungle, how you control noise, how you manage your men at night, how you respond when the artillery is not available and the air cover cannot find you, and the only thing standing between your position and a Japanese infiltration is the training and discipline of the men in your immediate vicinity. The New Zealand veterans who arrived in the Solomons in 1943 were looking at an American military that had not solved those problems. The 43rd Division's record was not unknown to them. The psychiatric casualty numbers, the collapse of the 169th Regiment's discipline on the first night, the need for 4 divisions where one had been planned. These were the operational context into which the 14th Brigade Group was arriving. The men did not arrive with illusions about what the terrain was going to ask of them. They arrived with a specific preparation that the record of what had preceded them suggested the Americans had lacked. And then there is Vella La Vella itself. The Americans had landed on Vella La Vella on 15th August 1943. They had established a beachhead. They had pushed the Japanese northward. By mid-September, more than a month after the landing, the Japanese garrison still held the northern portion of the island. The clearing operation that was supposed to follow the initial landing had stalled. The momentum that makes a compressed island operation efficient had not been sustained. When the 14th Brigade Group landed at that American beachhead on the 18th of September, the physical handover, one force replacing another, carried its own quiet statement. The Americans had held the South. They had not finished the North. The New Zealanders were arriving to complete what had not been completed. Admiral Halsey had been greatly disappointed that New Zealand could not field a full 3-brigade division. He had recorded that disappointment formally. New Zealand was not, in his assessment, pulling its weight. Now, in September 1943, with the Central Solomons campaign at a critical juncture and the northern half of Vella La Vella still in Japanese hands, Halsey's command was depending on the 2-brigade division he had been so disappointed in. The garrison troops, the mopping-up force, the coconut bombers, they had 18 days. What those 18 days produced has already been recorded in the previous chapter. The numbers are what they are, and they do not require elaboration. But the numbers are the outcome, they are the last line of a longer sentence that begins with Barrowclough and the Kaimai Ranges and the jungle training in New Caledonia and the month of patrols on Guadalcanal before a shot was fired in anger. The men who produced those numbers had arrived at Guadalcanal in August and had walked across the bones and the shell craters and the plowed field aftermath of a different army's different approach. They had smelled what Bill Mitchell described, the smell that you cannot get rid of, the smell of dead bodies in the tropics that made it impossible to eat your lunch when you came back from the front. They had looked at all of that. They had said nothing that is recorded. They had gone north to Vella La Vella and done their job in 18 days with 32 men dead. And then they came home, and almost no one talked about it. That part of the story, why the record looks the way it does, what American military analysis eventually concluded about the doctrine gap between these two forces, and what it meant that the men who produced one of the most efficient infantry operations of the Pacific Campaign were sent back to farms and factories and given the nickname coconut bombers. That is the final chapter, and it is the one that reframes everything that came before it. In June 1944, the 3rd New Zealand Division was withdrawn from the Pacific and returned to New Zealand. The men who came back were not greeted with the kind of reception that the scale of what they had done might have warranted. There was no major public commemoration. There was no formal accounting of the operational record set against comparable American formations in the same theater. What there was, for most of them, was a processing center, a period of leave, and then a direction back into the civilian economy that the war had hollowed out. Farms needed workers. Sawmills needed workers. The country that had sent these men into the Pacific now needed them back in it, producing food and timber and the basic material of a wartime economy that had been running on reduced manpower for 3 years. Some went to Italy to reinforce the 2nd New Zealand Division, which was still fighting through the peninsula. Most went home. On October 20th, 1944, the 3rd New Zealand Division was formally disbanded. Not because it had failed, because New Zealand had run out of people. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear. A nation of approximately 1.5 million people had, by 1944, committed forces to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, to Italy, and to the Pacific simultaneously. The 2nd Division was fighting in Europe under Freiburg, building a reputation that would become one of the most celebrated in the Commonwealth. The 3rd Division was fighting in the Pacific under Barrowclough, building a record that would become one of the least known. The manpower required to sustain both, alongside the agricultural and industrial workforce that kept the Allied supply chain functioning, had exceeded what New Zealand could provide. A choice had to be made. The 3rd Division was the one that came home. The men who returned carried with them a campaign that the public record had not prepared anyone to properly understand. They had conducted 3 opposed operations in the Solomons, Vella La Vella, the Treasury Islands, the Green Islands, each one accomplished with the efficiency that 2 years of progressive training had built into them. The Vella La Vella numbers have already been stated in this film. 32 dead, 18 days, 200 to 300 Japanese killed. An island cleared and handed back to the Allied advance. What they came home to was the nickname, Coconut Bombers. Harry Bioletti had served on Vella La Vella with the 30th Battalion. He later wrote the battalion's history, Pacific Kiwis, a record of the 30th Battalion's service that exists in the archive and is cited by researchers who look for it. He chose, when the war was over, to transfer to the European theater rather than go home, because he wanted to stay with his mates. That choice and the quiet way he described it, he wanted to continue at government expense, he said, and he was unattached. Tells you something about what. The Pacific Campaign had made of these men. They were not broken. They were not traumatized into silence. They had done their job, and they were prepared to keep doing it in a different theater because the alternative was to stop. Bioletti is not a household name. Pacific Kiwis is not a widely read book. The 30th Battalion's record on Vella La Vella is not taught in military academies as an example of effective small unit jungle doctrine in the Pacific theater. Admiral Halsey's complaint that New Zealand was not pulling its weight is in the official record. The operational comparison between Vella La Vella and New Georgia is not. This is the question this film has been building toward, and it deserves to be asked plainly. Why does the record look the way it does? Part of the answer is structural. The Americans ran this theater. They provided the naval forces, the air coverage, the logistical infrastructure, and the command hierarchy that determined which operations were designated as main efforts and which were designated as follow-on tasks. When you control the structure, you also control, to a significant degree, what gets recorded, what gets emphasized, and what gets filed away under a label, like mopping up. The 3rd New Zealand Division operated as a subordinate formation within an American command. It did not write its own operational history in the terms that American military documentation used. What it produced was absorbed into a larger narrative in which American formations were the primary actors and Allied contributions were, at best, supporting detail. Part of the answer is about scale. The American experience on New Georgia was catastrophic enough to generate its own documentation. The neuropsychiatric studies, the after-action reports, the command assessments that tried to understand what had gone wrong and how to prevent it happening again. Disaster produces paperwork. Efficiency, comparatively, does not. The 14th Brigade, group's operation on Vella La Vella, was clean enough, fast enough, and contained enough that it did not generate the volume of analytical documentation that the 43rd Division's collapse on New Georgia produced. Success, in this particular case, was its own kind of invisibility. And part of the answer is the one that no official record will state, but that the comparison of numbers makes unavoidable. The doctrine that Barrowclough built, combined arms battalion combat teams, progressive jungle training, small unit independence, the entire operational philosophy that produced 32 dead in 18 days, was a direct implicit criticism of what American formations had done in the same theater with 4 times the resources. Acknowledging it fully would have required acknowledging the gap. Military institutions, then as now, are not naturally inclined toward that kind of comparative self-examination in public. The 3rd Division was not forgotten because it was insignificant. It was forgotten because remembering it accurately was inconvenient to a narrative that the larger coalition needed to maintain. The men who trained in the Kaimai Ranges, who spent years moving through jungle before they moved through it, in anger, who executed a 2-axis pincer movement on Vela La Vela with the patience and precision that their preparation had built into them. Those men came home to farms and factories and a nickname that inverted everything their record actually showed. They were not coconut bombers. They were the proof of something that military institutions spend decades and enormous sums of money trying to produce and rarely achieve. A force that understood its environment so completely and had been prepared for it so thoroughly that it could do in 18 days what a force 4 times its size could not do in 36. The 3rd New Zealand Division was disbanded on 20th October 1944. Not because it had failed, because a nation of 1.5 million people had already given everything it had across 3 theaters of a world war, and there was simply nothing left to give. What they produced with what they had was, by any documented measure, extraordinary. Almost no one knows it. That is not an accident, and it is not acceptable. The record exists. The numbers are there. The comparison holds. All that was ever required was for someone to place them side by side and refuse to look away. That is what this film has done.